A very warm welcome to every one of you who's joined us today in this, our 5th Construction Investigation Group Services Masterclass. We have a really international group, and for those of you joining times well outside the normal working day, well, thank you for making the time. Our goal is that each of you should have one great insight or good idea prompted by the content and discussion today, and that will be success for us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Bucklow. I'm a commercial mediator, and as part of CIG services, I specialise in accelerated dispute resolution and project mediation, and I'm your host for this morning's session. Our masterclasses started out as a way to replicate in-person meetings and networking virtually, as we're all missing those opportunities for conversations over a coffee or even a glass of something stronger. Hence our events with small discussion groups in breakout rooms, and they've been very popular. Our previous masterclasses have been held at a slightly earlier time, and they've been for an hour and 15 minutes. We're experimenting with time of day and length of event to see what works best. Today's masterclass is timed slightly later and is just 50 minutes. After the presentation, our speakers will answer questions in our main virtual room. So please add your questions in the chat. And please let us know which format works best for you. Nick and Richard will make their presentation, which will last around 25 minutes. We'll then have 15 to 20 minutes questions. But before we start, I'd just like to make sure that everyone is comfortable with the technology, even though we're all very Zoom friendly these days, or perhaps not friendly. There are a couple of pointers. I will mute everyone when we start the presentation. You can unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon at the bottom of your screens on the far left. You can unmute yourself temporarily by pressing your space bar if you're joining on a laptop or a desktop. When you release the space bar, you will be muted again automatically. If you wish to send a message, then please use the chat function. If someone sent you a message or there's a general message, there'll be an alert, which is a number on the chat icon. And please let us know in the chat if you do not want your name included in any attendance list. I will remind you at the end of the session again. CIG Services is a group of innovative and experienced construction professionals from many disciplines. We rapidly evaluate construction, operational, and financial performance to meet project or investment objectives, or indeed to support turnaround. The publication of Global Construction Success in 2019 by our very own Charles O'Neill, to which many of our group contributed, sets out a coherent landscape for the future of construction, not just in the UK, but globally. More recently, Bandit Capitalism, Carillion and the Corruption of the British State by Bob Wiley set out the context for one catastrophic collapse. The industry press reports new scandals and revelations on a daily basis, and the dispute resolution sector is already seeing a significant rise in construction disputes due to the complications introduced by the pandemic. According to recent statistics, construction insolvencies are at an all-time low, a temporary state of affairs in our view, based on an extraordinary set of circumstances which have acted like a dam. Construction is the pillar on which economies are built and sustained. Infrastructure is the lifeblood of efficient society. We are facing a prolonged period of uncertainty and scarcity, and there's never been a time where efficiency, timeliness, and innovation was more urgent or more influential in the economic health of our world. Our event today is titled Major Projects, 5 Areas to Help Achieve Success or Avoid Failure. Our first presenter is Nick Field. Nick is a chartered civil engineer by background. He has particular expertise in project program, construction management, and an impressive UK and international portfolio of appointments as project director on a number of major schemes within the private and public sectors. Equally, he's made his mark in major business transformation and IT projects. Richard Bayfield began his career working for Costain on major projects, including the Thames Barrier in 1976. He has held senior roles as contractor, consultant, and client, and his recent experience includes several major capital projects, including the Sainsbury Welcome Centre at UCL, the new Lambeth Palace Library, and the Gradell Quad at New College, Oxford, and HS2. So Charles will set the context, Charles O'Neill will set the context for our presentation, and I am just going to share the screen, but Charles, if you would like to say your introductory words.
Oh, thanks, Amanda, and hello, everyone. We really do have an international group. I just let you know that we have people from New Zealand and Australia, where it's the middle of the night, from Ethiopia and Turkey, South Africa, from Italy and Germany, the Channel Islands, and a good number from the UK. So thank you all for joining us. Now, we all know that major projects, particularly government infrastructures, keep running off the rails, heavily over budget and very late on delivery. And this will continue unless commercial clients, government authorities, consultants, contractors and suppliers learn to get the fundamentals right when planning these projects, because there is absolutely no doubt that success or failure is largely determined before contracts are signed. Here at CIG Services, we have a team of very experienced experts, and we undertake independent reviews and assist with getting the structuring right on major projects. Today, Nick Field and Richard Bayfield are going to take you through some of the most important issues that determine this success or failure. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Charles. And let me just add my thanks to all those participating. Really happy and pleased to have you all on board for this presentation. And, I hope you enjoy it. So the number one area that we're going to start with, and that is because it is the most important area, is understanding complexity. And in our experience, and there's plenty of independent research backs that out, it is the underestimation of the complexity of the project, which is the biggest cause of failures of major projects. And that has several different facets to it. So firstly, can you put the issue slide on, please, Amanda? Thank you.
Hold on a second, let me just reshare. It's got stuck behind.
Okay, well, I'll keep to it. So firstly, we have the issue where clients launch into projects without really working out what their requirements are. And in that situation, what we have is emerging scope. And of course, when you introduce large scope changes, particularly when the project's in its delivery phase, it can only end in tears. And I suppose a call célèbre that would be the Hollywood House project, which Richard will talk to you a bit later on. A second major area is stakeholder management. And large projects, the stakeholder environment is incredibly large and complex. And very often that complexity is misunderstood. And in particular, what commitments will need to be made to satisfy those requirements. And when those have to be introduced later in the project, again, huge increases in cost and time. For example, HS2, the Chiltern Line section of that line alone, to add the additional tunnelling to satisfy environmental objections, added over £1 billion to the cost of that project. So really important to understand that environment. Politics, any form of human endeavour, and particularly major projects, involves politics, be that with a big P or small p, intra-company politics, and they can have huge impacts on the project. So If we compare, for example, the success of the 2012 Olympics and Paralympics, where there was really good, what I call top cover for the project, and and that was a big fundamental in the success of that project, compared to, say, HS2 again, which remains a political football and has done since its inception, you can understand the sort of impacts that might have on the outcomes of major projects. Resource demands are very often misunderstood. And this is particularly in the case where, these resources are maybe quite specialized or rare. So, for instance, signaling engineering or nuclear power, and not understanding or underestimating how much and what and when that resource is required can have a major impact on major projects. And the last one is method and technology. And Amanda, maybe that you can put the next slide up, please. And so that can be in the guise of just simply misunderstanding the complexity of delivering the construction of the project. So a case study here would be Wembley Stadium. You'll remember that one. Multiplex took that on a fixed price D&B contract. But they had hugely underestimated the complexity of that project, particularly the big arch, which is a bit of a landmark. And as a result, costs increased for almost threefold. It was 5 years late. And Multiplex themselves lost over £100 million on that project because they had underestimated the complex challenges of delivering that project. Crossrail, which is a current one, and of course that was a bit of an exemplar project until about 2017. But it was only when the project came to realize the challenge of converting the civils project into a working railway and all the systems integration and technology challenges that face that the problems really flush themselves out. And currently we're looking at a £3 billion cost overrun and a 3 years delay. And, if I'm a betting person, that might get even worse. And why this all really matters is that when these projects go wrong, they tend to go really badly wrong. Maybe doubling of costs 10 years late is not rare on some of these projects. And what that does, of course, it ruins reputations for politicians. Funders run scared, contractors go bust, and it just makes these big projects more and more difficult to launch. And as Amanda, we rely on these projects as a society. So what's our advice? How can you stop this happening? So measure twice, cut once, by which I mean invest time in the development phase of the project, where you can work out the full detail, really shake down the scope of what's required. Because it's always better to spend 5 years in development, say, and 3 years in delivery than vice versa. At the end of the day, you'll save an awful lot of money and an awful lot of heartache. Plan in detail and do the groundwork, particularly around the high risk areas. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the next set of slides. Understanding the environment. So how powerful are the stakeholders? What is their position? What's involved in getting the consents and approvals that are required? Land acquisition, all of these issues. And you want to understand those before you launch into the project. And so really understanding them, having a proper management process for that. And we often find that stakeholder management is looked as an afterthought. It's actually central to successful delivery of projects. So understanding that is key. Engage the experts. Don't guesstimate at the cost. And get them on board early. And the benefits of early contractor involvement have been proven time and time again. On what price would Multiplex pay now if they'd have got their structural engineering specialists on board when they were bidding that job? And so it's really important to get the right expertise on board at the early stage during the development and planning phase. Recognize technology and handover risk. And recognize, the risk that you're importing. If you're using novel technologies, etc., you are importing risk. You need to understand that, and again, it goes back to getting the right experts on board that can advise on that. And finally, don't commit too soon, because clients always remember the first number that you give them. And if you do that, you're in for, heartache the whole way through the project. And there's a little quote at the bottom there from Mark Wilde, who's the current CEO of Crossrail, that says, a lot of the problems that they're incurring now as a result of political pressure, making them start too soon before they'd really bottomed out the issues around Crossrail. Thank you, Amanda. So the next area where we quite often see issues is around planning, investigation, and control. So what are the issues there? Well, sometimes we see incomplete or over-optimistic planning, not really understanding not having done the groundwork to understand what's involved. The planning approach is very often wrong. It's either not enough detail, so the work hasn't been done, or it's so much detail that you can't see the wood for the trees and you get lost. There's no strategic overlay to it. Insufficient investigation, again, particularly around these high risk areas, where you've got novel technology, refurbishment projects, are notorious. I mean, Houses of Parliament, for instance, how bad might that get? You need to understand what's there to be able to scope it out. Commissioning and or handover, that is, allowances, almost always too short, and that process almost always starts too late in the process. Undue optimism. And what we find is that people that do these big projects, they love big projects, and that leads to undue optimism. And this, of course, is where independent peer reviews can be so powerful, because it just is clear-eyed view of where you are, and it just keeps everyone on the straight and narrow. And then the last one is inadequate control tools, and that can be either not sufficient control or so complex that you can't see the wood for the trees. So how do we improve on that? What's our advice? Well, firstly, it sounds obvious, but do the research. And this is where the extended or the detailed development and planning period is so important. You cannot odds that. You have to understand what risk you're taking on and what's involved in delivering the project. Put science behind time allowances. So particularly where you have got novel technology or that sort of thing, where it is actually quite difficult to understand exactly what's involved, put some science behind any time allowances. Do the benchmarking, do sensitivity analysis, quantified risk analysis, etc. But make sure that your allowances are certainly adequate, or we'd always advise better too long than too short, of course. Quite often we see projects where there's a 3,000 line Primavera P6 program and everyone's got it nailed. Well, in our view, that's really just not a management tool, and such a program certainly won't survive the first engagement with the enemy. So much better in our view to have a one-page strategic plan, maybe 50, 100 lines maximum on that plan. Each of those lines is underpinned by detailed programs which validate the timescales allowed. That way you've got the detail you need, but you can maintain strategic and control and drive the project to the milestones. Right size the control and information systems. And there's loads and loads of different systems out there, and they all claim they work out the box and they're fully integrated, enterprise systems, etc. In our view, I'd treat those claims with slight skepticism. The important issue, though, is that you design the control system to give you the management information that you need to control the project, or not vice versa. So don't accept the limitations of the system. Design the system that gives you the data you need, because that is essential to maintaining control of projects. On these larger projects, we'd always advise using earned value analysis. That's the integrated time cost analysis, because it gives you so many more powerful metrics and trending statistics than relying on critical path analysis alone. It's a very powerful technique and really can help you keep control. And the last thing is the integrated work breakdown structure, organization breakdown structure, and cost breakdown structure is really, really fundamental to project control. So that should be agreed up front, embedded up front across the entire program. And the sooner that's agreed and set in place, the better. Thank you, Amanda. So in the next area, so this is a case study of one which went right. And this is Terminal 5 Heathrow, huge project, over 4 billion, but that was a decade in the planning. BAA, the client, they were very, had the foresight to get key supplier partnerships and frameworks in place well in advance of that project ever starting. They used those relationships to build their other portfolio of projects and pre-trial methods, benchmark costs, et cetera, et cetera. And that team that were used to working together were there to input into the collaborative planning of T5. And the result, on time, on budget delivery, and a bit of a case study of how to do it right. So the next point is the commercial environment. And there's a quote here by John Ruskin, which you can read as fast as I can talk. But basically, the point he's making is every job has a right price, not the cheapest price, the right price. And I think he's a very wise man in that regard. So what are the issues? Well, very often we see that the commercial and contract structure is seen as sort of almost outside the project itself, the delivery project. But actually, of course, it's fundamental to the delivery of the project, because the reality is you cannot have an adversarial contract and collaborative relations. The two are mutually exclusive. So where we see contracts which tend to shovel all the risk to the contractor, that creates behaviors that can destroy trust, and trust is the lubricant of collaboration. And as Richard will say, we'll tell you a little later on, I mean, collaboration is fundamental to delivering these major projects. So it's really important that you know the contract structure underpins and promotes trust, but where you get non-alignment of objectives of the parties, you've got no chance of that happening. And what we find is, because of this lack of trust, you know, there's almost this poacher-turn mentality relationship built up, and profit seems to be a dirty word, but of course it's fundamental to the success of projects and for contractors to deliver, you know, for their business survival. And what we find is when those factors aren't in place, we enter into what I call the project death spiral. And when the money's not right, nothing's right, and things go from bad to worse. So what's our advice? How to get it right? Firstly, allocate risk fairly. Every dog has his day, and it will most likely come back and bite you if you try to shovel all the risk off to one party. Use industry standard contracts, and NEC, and there's others out there, that suite is designed to promote collaboration. But what we tend to see is that clients and advisors amend these contracts so they become an adversarial contract again, and you defeat the purpose. So we would always advise against that. Don't buy on the lowest price, and the bigger the project, the more important the quality aspects become. So have a balanced approach to how you select your contractors. Fair treatment will always win out. Seek the win-win, pay on time, have a predefined method for resolving disputes when they arise. Because when you let these things fester, that's when trust breaks down and you get back into this horrible death spiral. Incentive mechanisms, if they're well structured, they do work. And not only that, they create alignment between the parties. So everybody's focused on the success of the project rather than their own individual interests. So we do recommend those wherever we can. And lastly, frameworks. If you have a portfolio of projects, frameworks really do deliver results. And I think the BAA example I gave earlier is a demonstration of that. So lastly, here's a case study, which I think is a slightly sad tale. So this is the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff, the project a few years old now. Contractor Langs took that one on, fixed price D&B, absolutely watertight contract, no relief events. Soon became apparent that they'd underestimated the complexity of delivering that project, particularly with the retractable roof. Bottom line, they made a huge loss on the project, and it was one of the projects that sent them bust and ended up in Lang, in my opinion, one of the great names in UK construction, being sold for £1. Now, I suppose from the client's point of view, it was a success. Clearly, from Lang's point of view, it's a huge failure of governance, if nothing else. But it's an open question here. You know, as an industry, do we think that is a success or a failure? Anyway, maybe that's one we can debate at some other time. But now I'll pass across to Richard, who will talk a bit about collaboration and stakeholder management. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Thank you indeed. And I like that reminder that the Six Nations will be here at the weekend to cheer us all up. So thank you very much for the rugby reminder. And also just a reminder that about a year ago I was wearing a tie, but this is just a photograph to show that ties were in fashion a year ago. My subjects are collaboration and stakeholders. And I think the key things that come out of these sort of two headlines, and we're doing 3-4 minutes on each headline, are the issues of culture, communication, and governance. And I think about 3 case studies I'm going to talk about today. 2 are projects that I had deep involvement with, and one with very good public records, but everything here is in the public domain. So I'm speaking from a knowledgeable position, but this is all in the public domain. And when I asked the question, why collaborate? I got involved with helping Honda develop the major car factory down at Swindon, their major European plant about 25 years ago. And their culture was around innovation and quality, and the statements there about innovation and quality came from manufacturing when the company was first started. The photograph on the left shows the factory being built in the bottom half of the photograph. The steelwork you can see there, that was the factory number 2, and up at the top part of the photograph, that was factory number 1. And it's a story of 2 factories that were built about 13 years apart. One under the old adversarial system, and new under a more collaborative approach. The next slide will show the sort of mechanisms, the culture that Honda set. Standard Porter Gavin on site, but everyone within the Honda team wore a white suit, the same as the 5,000 people working in the factory. They wore the same uniform as the managing director and the directors. There was absolutely a view of equality. 25 years or so, this was seen as quite an outrageous position to take. And when I was interviewed for the job, the one thing that Paul Roberts, who was the director of Honda at that time of engineering and facilities, explained the culture. We'll move on to the next slide, thanks. And the second project won a British Construction Industry Award. It won it because Honda set up a very innovative approach, non-adversarial, one team, one goal, very proactive, a team culture. As Nick mentioned earlier, there were fair contracts. There were uses of early warnings. They had early warnings before the new engineering contract came in with early warnings. There were others doing the same thing. So this was a sort of big change in the culture of the industry, I think prompted by Latham back in the 90s. And when one looks at the results of this approach, one compares the key metrics, cutting away all the fluffy stuff. Actually, when you get down to the bottom line, the second factory was built at a 40% saving to the first factory. Car Plant 1, 1989, was delivered at about nearly £1,200 a square metre. Car Plant 2, 2002, it won awards for delivery. It didn't win awards for architecture, but the cost per square metre was £700, just over £700 a square metre. And that wasn't through beating up the supply chain, that was being more efficient, working out who was doing things twice. And the industry has a habit of doing things twice, 3 times, making sure that things are done once, and making sure that there's learning fed from the difficulties on the first plant back into the second plant. The first plant had commissioning that probably took 3 years. The second plant, it was a matter of months. And actually, it was a more pleasurable way of working. Everyone enjoyed it. Everyone got a buzz out of it. As Nick referred to, the death spiral when a project's on in the last phase of an unhappy project. It's not a good environment to be in. So if we can just think about the collaborative culture at Honda, what I learned there, questions like why and what if, early warning, and a really big quote from one of the directors: claims represent inefficiency. That's a huge statement in comparison with the mentality, the mindset of simply offloading risk down the line, which is largely the mentality, I think, of many projects, particularly in the public sector, I'm sad to say. And it was looking at sustainability. So those are the hallmarks of the culture. I'm conscious that we're on a very tight time scale. So my second subject is stakeholders, and this brings in the whole subject of politics and governance. And I think so many books on project management centre around the technicalities, as Nick said, the detailed programmes, the earned value. But actually, big projects are about politics. And I think they go wrong when the politics goes wrong and when the governance goes wrong. I've got an example of governance charts here. This is a fairly generic chart. It was used on one of the projects that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But I think at the start, or when one's doing a peer review, one needs to map out key questions like where's the money coming from? Who's the funder? How is that being managed and monitored? Is there a client board? What about the stakeholders and the users? These are all in the top part of the chart. This is all around client in the top half of the chart. I think client has a very wide meaning. Unless the client's an entrepreneur like Alan Sugar or Richard Branson, and you know that that's who you're working for, most of these big projects have multiple clients, taxpayers. At the bottom half of the chart, you then see the traditional delivery mechanism of a project manager, contractor, design team. But I think this takes a lot of effort to unpick. If I look at the next two photographs, who are these stakeholders? The man on the left is the late Donald Dwyer, the Scottish minister who pioneered the Scottish Parliament, both as a politician and then he led the building project for a long time. The one on the right is Lord Sainsbury, who was the former science minister. He is probably an unknown Bill Gates type character who's given over £1 billion to good causes, particularly in science and in Africa and around politics. Lord David Sainsbury, his project's on the next slide. You will see the Sainsbury Wellcome Neural Centre on the left in London, and the Scottish Parliament on the right-hand side at Holyrood. And the key things about these two projects are, again, the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre was a British construction industry award-winning project. That's for delivery. Its architecture is very interesting. The Wavy building, those that work in London will know it's opposite the Arup offices in Fitzrovia. Governance was very strong on that building. It had to be. There was a university involved. There were two major donors, the Gatsby Foundation, Lord Sainsbury's charity, and also the Wellcome Trust. And they were putting tens of millions of pounds into this project. And they made sure with funding agreements, with contracts, with all the supply chain, with very clear demarcation of responsibility, how this was going to be delivered. They even agreed if there was any excess, how that would be shared. And on the right, we have the Holyrood Parliament. It started off at a £10 million project. Donald Dwyer chaired the design group, that commissioned an architect. Eventually, it was a Spanish architect that won the award. It morphed into a £400 million project. And what's very interesting for those that are interested in major projects, the Fraser report that's in the public domain, the Hollywood report by Lord Fraser QC, really dissects the decision making. And the key quote I remember from his report was this project could never, ever be built for less than 200 million. Although it started off at 10, it could never be built for less than that. And I just return now to our subjects, a summary of the subjects on the next slide that we've covered in a breakneck speed: complexity, planning, investigation, the commercial environment, collaboration, stakeholders. Now I'm going to hand back to Charles O'Neill. And I will, I think, give a brief mention of his book. It's been mentioned by Lord Adair as one that everyone who gets involved in these projects should think about reading. There it is, Lord Adonis, Chair of the UK National Infrastructure Commission. Thank you, Charles. Thank you for pulling some of us together. And over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Richard and Nick. Very, very interesting points you've made. To me, what is really clear and obvious out of all that is that just a couple of things. Clients and contractors absolutely must engage in very detailed preparation. You can't half do it. The client must select the right form of contract for the circumstances and select the best qualified contractors and suppliers, not just the cheapest. Given all that, we think that there's a real need to have far more intensive training in project investigation, in planning, in risk management and due diligence, estimating and cost planning, all these key areas that dictate the end result. Managers need this broader education so they understand the bigger picture and can work as a properly unified team to put these projects together, not just out of silos and with no wider responsibility. But we're about to go in, before we go into the Q&A, the big question that really puzzles us is this: why won't people invest more time into these vital areas to safeguard the project? Another 6 to 12 months will be repaid in spades. The extra cost and time is peanuts compared to the downside. So I'll leave you with that thought, and over to you, Amanda, for the Q&A session.
Thank you, and thank you to our presenters. I am aware that we are running a little late, so hopefully we do have time for some questions. I have one here from Anton Kraus, who is from South Africa, and that is: major infrastructure projects are most often very complex in nature, and complexity tends to invite various forms of corruption at all phases of a project. Seeing that corruption is one of the greatest obstacles to the development of safe and adequate infrastructure, what are CIG's thoughts in respect of how government and private sector clients can reduce the scourge of corruption in the industry? Richard Bayfield, I wonder if you'd like to take that.
What a good question.
Sorry?
What a good question. I think I'd like to see on government projects, all documents backed up to the cloud and the keys kept by the National Audit Office or some other authority such as that. This would stop the purging and the shredding of documents when the going gets tough for individuals, for businesses and government ministers. It's only been in recent years that I've even learned on 2 major projects that there has been a shredding department that's taken centre stage at times. I think that would avoid this chance of rewriting history. I think back to when I worked with Honda, the main contractor's server was open to Honda as a client with all information apart from salaries. The punchline was that server was never accessed. But I think actually knowing that information, if you're trying to build an operation of trust, there needs to be an awareness that information is shared and can't be rewritten out of history in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Julie Wood, you've got a question.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Some really good points. I think that mine is around, many projects, especially in the public sector, become really politicised. So, it's more about shovel ready rather than shovel worthy. And there seems to be a major drive in being seen to be doing and seeing people plan and seeing people design doesn't seem to be quite as sexy as seeing people with a back actor or, you know, a piling rig. So the question to the panel is, you know, how do we get a change of mindset and depoliticize projects?
Nick, would you like to take that? Nick Field.
Yes, and a really good question, Julia. I think it goes back to the point that Charles was making. You know, these projects keep going wrong, and as I said at the start of the presentation, time and time again, independent reviews, reports, academic research says that the reason is they're not planned in advance. People haven't taken the time to understand what the challenge is. And again, we get this. And I think it almost also feeds into Charles's point about better education, you know, and politicians listening to what their advisors say. And, you know, and the IPA and people like that, they have reviews set up to do that. They've got experts in there, and they need to listen to the advice because, you know, it will go wrong and you rue the day, and, you know, and bad projects ruin reputations, don't they? So I don't think that's actually an answer to your question, Julia. It's one that we scratch our heads about as well. But I think it's incumbent upon us as an industry, and this is part of what we as CIG are about, is to try and promote this understanding and a better understanding of how you govern these projects properly and you make sure they go right. So a bit of a waffle there, but that's my view.
Okay, I've got a question from Graham Clarkson. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. A question for the panel. In my experience of project and project management, there's a lot of focus on the initial budget and then the outturn cost against that budget. But if you follow any decent project management methodology, it starts with an investment case on the basis of the value that that facility will deliver to the sponsor. And I'd just like to know from the CLG why we don't spend much time ascertaining the value of the facility, and therefore everyone involved understanding what that value is.
Thank you, Graham. Now, who'd like to take that? I wonder. Richard Bayfield.
Thank you. Thanks, Graham. I think it's partly education, but it's actually education amongst the politicians and those who are commissioning these projects. You know, I look back to Donald DeWare, and his role was sorting out a referendum to win over the Scottish people to have a Scottish Parliament. He did that really successfully with a 75% majority. Wouldn't that be the case with more recent referenda? But he was then appointed to run the competition for architects and so on. He had no experience in building. He was an expert politician and should literally stop at that point. He was given a budget of 10 to 40 million and he took it up to 200 or beyond when the construction industry had to deal with it. And I think actually it's very high level education. And I think we taxpayers need to say that HS2, it's not good enough. Personal view, thank you.
Can I just add to that as well, Richard? In as much as, you know, obviously the Treasury Green Book process is supposed to do exactly as you say, Graham. You know, you've got strategic case, outline case, and the cost benefit ratio is the criteria, and there's a sort of threshold of, I don't know, 3.3 or whatever it is, and that's all okay until the projects go wrong, and because they go so badly wrong, all of a sudden the costs outweigh any benefits you're going to get, because we get the complexity, misunderstanding of what's involved, don't do the planning right, all of a sudden the cost outweighs the benefit. So it goes back, I think, again to proper, better scrutiny at each stage of that development cycle to make sure that you really do have the costs nailed.
Thank you, Nick. I've had a comment in the chat and a hand up from Ruth Bagley. Ruth, would you like to perhaps incorporate your comment and your your question.
Thank you. Just so that people understand my background, 35 years working in the public sector, 16 years as a chief executive, leading in my junior years on a number of construction projects to some success in this context, I should say, and overseeing some others, and working also with the private sector. So in answer to the why is it a big problem in the public sector, certainly in the political parts of the public sector, it is the political cycle, the electoral cycle, the need, whether that's a personality need or a political need of many politicians to seem to have delivered something quickly. And so that is the world they live in. It may not be a good world in the context we're talking about. On the more positive side about how do we take that forward, it can be done, and it is about being very clear and getting sign up to the outcome and how long it will take, and getting a budget in place which is a good estimate of where we are, and an understanding of the impact of time on that budget. So not telling everyone it's going to cost £5 million and forgetting to tell them as the project is 10 years, actually delivered 10 years later, that there's a thing called construction inflation, and keeping those people involved and understanding at a sponsor level of what is happening. So my question, therefore, is how, at a sort of broad level rather than at a very specific project level, can we get politicians, people who work in that political environment, like myself as a chief executive, I was subject to the indirect impact of that. How can we get people really geared up to taking a longer term view, but an outcomes-based view in the end, given that politicians in particular have different drivers on them?
Thank you, Ruth. Does anybody want to respond to that from CIG? Richard, you've got your hand up again. Yes.
I think part of this is going to be about the public mood, and public opinion, and the media. And I think actually we can't deliver failure in terms of HS2 and Crossrail. I feel responsible as a member of the construction industry at some of these awful headlines. And so I think there will be a movement. I think most MPs will be, although they're protective of the next 5 years, they need to take a view that this system is no longer working properly for those big projects. And as Julie mentioned, this ambition to get piling rigs and excavators on site as quickly as possible. I remember John Harvey Jones saying that was the difference between working with the Japanese and working in Britain. And actually the Japanese always finished sooner than the Brits did. This was 30 years ago when he was working for ICI. So plan more, spend more time planning and preventing, but it's education and public opinion. I think the construction industry is at risk of going where estate agents have gone and bankers have gone. We've got some very bad news out there at the moment, and we're going to have to corporately manage that as an industry. Carillion, Grenfell, and these projects in big delay. Crossrail, absolutely. I know a lot of Londoners that have bought houses on the expectation of moving into properties within a year's time that will be serviced by Crossrail, and then 4 or 5 years later, there's nothing in sight. Thank you.
I'm sorry, so I can't work out how to put my hand up. But anyway, just to add to that, Richard, and part of the mitigation, I think, is if you look at Highways, what was the Highways Agency? They went across to Highways England, but in recognition of the very fact you mentioned, Ruth, that you just get political interference, and in the context of a major project, you might change Parliament, 5-6 times during that period. And so the idea of that is that there's a portfolio of projects, it's pre-agreed, and you roll out those projects. So the idea is that you reduce the political interference that's involved in delivering that strategic portfolio. Of course, it's not perfect, and we've seen Lower Thames Crossing and Stonehenge, being still very, very politically intense. But that is at least, I think, an attempt to address the very short-termism that you absolutely rightly referred to.
Okay, thank you. Ed Moore, you had your hand up and you put it down again. Would you like to say whether you would still like to pose your question?
It's kind of taking on from the points that everyone's made, so I didn't want to sort of bash the point too much. But I don't know if I'm cynical or not, but to what extent is there the opportunity for the major projects to be very roughly calculated as terms as price goes, particularly by government, so that a blame for the cost of it can then be put squarely on the industry's shoulders? And if all of the in-depth work were done and the real costs understood, would some of the major projects ever get off the ground just because of that political stance of looking at large numbers from a distance of 20 years and trying to persuade the public that they represent good value?
Anybody wish to tackle that from our team particularly?
Well, I mean, well, it is a point, Ed, and you know, if you look historically, the London Underground went hugely over budget. Channel Tunnel Rail Link, hugely. Would you be without it? Of course you wouldn't. And so there is a kind of, I suppose, an argument for the head in the sand review of things, but it's not a really sensible or honest way of doing it. And of course, when projects go over budget, it puts strain on the whole treasury drawdown, etc. Again, this is one of the reasons that was driving PPIs, because it's an off-balance sheet transaction. So what you say does happen, but it's not a very honest way of doing it. In the long term, it's going to catch you up. And of course, as I said, what happens, of course, is, the public see these projects, and they're going, 2-3 times over budget. Everyone's waiting for Crossrail. It's great, it's coming. Next thing I've got to wait another 3 years for it. Meanwhile, my taxes are going up to pay for it. And it just undermines overall the confidence in launching these big schemes, which means you don't do it, because the last thing politicians like is bad publicity. So the whole environment which you operate around actually mitigates against what we need. And this is one of the things, this is one of the reasons why demand always outstrips supply in our industry. So we wait till the tube is completely overrun because we run scared of developing these big projects because politicians don't like it. So I think there's a real get honest thing to be done here. And this is why we as the experts, we as the industry, need to really lobby the politicians and explain to them what's involved. And this is what I think, us senior members of the industry, it's our duty to do this.
Thank you, Nick. And that actually leads on very nicely to a question here from Bob Wiley on the parameters described by Nick and Richard. Where do we as a group stand on HS2?
Well, I'll give a first comment, which is picking up on Nick's last word. I think it's honesty. If there's a Keynesian economics case for employing a lot of people over the next few years to keep the economy going post-COVID, I can buy into those sort of arguments. To some extent, but let's be honest around the metrics of ticket sales and future returns and benefits in terms of reduced carbon and all that. And it's a mix of items, but it should be an honest one that the public can buy into.
Thank you. Does anybody else like to add to that? What about you, Charles? Do you have anything to add to that? And say no if you haven't.
Thanks, Amanda. No, I think Richard and Nick have covered it pretty well, actually.
Okay. Right.
I'd like to jump in a bit if I could, Amanda, on that. Just with the accent, it's nice to be a bit of foreign thinking. When I came to the UK about 10 years ago, I remember talking to Margaret Hodge at the time, and she was then chair of the Public Accounts Committee, and she'd just come from a Public Accounts Committee hearing on the value for money of HS2. And at that stage, the budget was about £36 billion, I think. And it was just on the verge of providing value for money. And the business case at that stage was on the reduced travel time and the efficiency that people have when they're not travelling. And at that stage, the Public Accounts Committee was saying, well, why don't we just put faster internet on the train? And so it's moved, though, from 36 billion now to over 100 billion. And it's still just on the verge. So I think it reinforces what's being said here. Part of it's optimism bias, and then the other part is it's what you hear now is the project's shovel ready. And to not proceed with it, which I think is Richard's point, to not proceed with it now is actually bad for the economy. And you've lost the money you've invested to date. But it really is a series of moving goalposts, in my view, in terms of justifying the expense, which is not to say you shouldn't go ahead.
Amanda, I do have one quick comment, if I could, please. Richard mentioned honesty, and we've been talking about efficiency all day. Now, 18 months ago, HS2 announced a budget increase from 56 million to 82 million, and they said that was because they forgot to include ground conditions in their cost estimates previously. I thought that was extraordinary. When you think about high-speed rail, ground conditions, you know, they're probably the biggest component. You've got cuttings and fill and tunnels and high-speed train tracks, and, you know, ground conditions affect everything. But they came out with an extraordinary statement, and I was just amazed. So it is about honesty and it's about efficiency. It's a combination. Don't try and pull the wool over anyone's eyes. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, thank you. I'm very aware that we have run over time. I have been keeping an eye on who's dropping off. We've still got a very good group. I just want to take a poll. Would you like to continue for another 5 minutes, or should I bring things to a close? I'm getting some nods here. Yeah, okay, well, if you don't want to continue, you know how to operate the tech in order to depart.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Yes, it's great. I've got I'm not sure if some of these people are still here, but I've got one here, which is cost and quality are not evaluated as it seems on the face of it, i.e. 30% cost and 70% quality. Lowest cost get topped marks, 100%, and others are measured from that. Best quality on individual questions is marked independently, and a lesser quality answer is not marked down. So cost often is more like 35% to 40% of the mechanism. I think what this is speaking to, this is from Julie Wood. Are you still here, Julie?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Right.
So,
oh, yes. So your question here, would you like to frame your question?
Yeah, so I think on the face of it, you know, when people are looking at whether they're going to tender or not, you know, 30/70 sounds reasonably attractive. But when you see how, you know, cost is actually in reality more than that 30% because of, you know, what I've set out there. And I think this is about openness again. You know, if it's going to be 40/60, let's just say it's 40/60, and then people can decide if they want to, you know, step into that.
Thank you. This is the balance, and I think, Nick, you talked about this in your presentation, is don't always go for the cheapest. It's actually looking at what the value is. And I imagine it's reassessing that value all the way along at different points.
Yeah, I think Julie's point about the evaluation process is correct, and I've been involved in many of those, and you can still get perverse outcomes. That is true. I think it, you know, and that's sort of one mechanism. But I think one needs to think about value in the broader sense here, and it goes back, I think, to trust. And getting the right expertise in at the right time. So our tendering process, our procurement process is all around, you know, we have to get a cost, we can't do it. Whereas actually what we really need is the right experts up front at the right time. So this is why sort of like two-stage sort of processes are so powerful, because it means that all the participants, you know, you've planned the job together before you get the contractor to sign up. He knows exactly what he's in for. He's shaped the plan. He's shaped the program. He knows the costs, and so you've got a good basis for a good relationship. So to me, that's, again, back to this, that's a much more honest way of doing things. And that's where you get the value. So I think it's bigger than just, you know, is it quality, is it cost? It's also about the procurement mechanisms we need, and making sure that we're not always focused on, you know, how much it costs, but, you know, that guy is the best, that's the best firm in the market. If we get them on board, they can give us invaluable advice up front that will stop us making these mistakes downstream. To me, that's value. So, yeah, it's broader than just how you evaluate, I think.
Thanks, Nick. And all the things somebody, Jamie Olsen mentioned, Ferreira, mentions that the construction playbook seems to cover many of the areas that we've been discussing today, in terms of setting out a government desire to do more planning, allocate risk fairly. Are documents such as this, the answers provided, then followed through? So there's an awful lot of good advice. We all know what we should be doing. We know what the problems are. So why isn't it happening? And does something like the construction playbook help? Anybody? And Richard, are you wiggling your pen? Say yes. You're on mute.
Amanda, Graham Clarkson's got his hand up. He'd like to have a word.
Do you want to answer that, Graham?
Well, it wasn't on that particular point, but it was coming back to Charles O'Neill's point, a very good point, about we don't seem to learn from our past lessons. And is it the litigious nature of construction that prevents us from adopting an open approach like the aviation industry, where they welcome people to come forward with areas where the industry could improve, and therefore feeding that back in to provide better outcomes on the projects?
Thank you. Richard, can you combine your answer with
why not? Yes, I think the aviation industry is a model industry where it's cool to be a whistleblower. It's cool to admit mistakes. I think that we are a much bigger industry, and certainly in terms of numbers, and we're fragmented. And I think that's a difficulty for the UK industry, that we've got something like 2.5 million employees and 250,000 businesses. Average size of a business is about 10 people. I think this point about lessons learned, and you go back to Latham and so on, all saying the same thing really as the playbook now. And I think the system has got some needs shaking up. I think there are people in the system that are very comfortable, people in big projects where actually it's more convenient to suppress the bad news. It keeps them in a position for a few more months or years. This is why I go back to Anton's comment around actually the ability to retain all that project information, to have one set of truth, I think is key. I won't say anything too controversial, but I am aware of projects where key information has been shredded and computer files have been deleted. And I don't think that if that happens, you won't get to where Graham is in terms of an open reporting situation. We have an industry where our sins can be buried.
Thanks, Richard. And I think on that point, I would like to invite some comment on how do we ensure transparency, and how can that information, be safeguarded? And I'm aware that we have 3, 4, 5 people who specialise in that particular area. And I wonder if one of them would like to speak to that. That's my question. Anybody? The governance part of it, safeguarding information, making sure that it's not changed or shredded. maybe that's another topic for another time.
Well, Amanda, I'm not an IT person, but I understand that blockchain is likely to provide a system to safeguard documents and emails and secure all the history of projects.
Yeah. Anybody want to add to that? I wonder if we've come to a natural end.
Bob has his hand up, Amanda.
Does he? Oh, Bob. Yes, thank you.
Hi. I should introduce myself by saying that I'm the author of the book you referred to at the start, Bandit Capitalism, Carillion, and the Corruption of the British State. I suppose the title gives it away that it isn't a praise poem, obviously, about how the Carillion experience evolved. However, I'm interested in making a comment on what Nick was talking there, and also Richard, about the process of procurement. Because in bandit capitalism, towards the end of its life, Carillion were given a huge contract for prison services for, I think, embracing 75% of the prisons in England and Wales. And they made a suicide bid of undercutting the costs that the prison service had put as parameter costs. They undercut them by 15%. And one of the parliamentary reports done by PACAC, the Constitutional Committee, headed then by Jenkins, said that one of the things that motivates this type of suicide bidding is that the government continually goes to the lowest cost tender. And irrespective of whether it's 60-40, 30-70, big corporates know that that is what the process is. So you have a system of procurement which the government insists is based on lowest cost. So if the government is motivating the industry in this way, what chance do we have of having an honest, open way of constructing, taking on major projects and costing them honestly from the start?
Can I just answer that one, Bob? I mean, the thing about it is, and it goes back to what Julie was saying. So the way you typically evaluate this, you have a commercial bid and a quality bid, and the two you probably know that. Now the trouble with a company like Carillion, of course, they'll have this huge marketing machine behind it, so put a really good quality bid in. But the costs will be low as well. So the government machine goes, chick, chick, must be right. And there's that old adage, isn't there? Nobody ever got sacked for choosing IBM. It's Carillion. What could possibly go wrong? And so it's a kind of, and it just points out that the lack of nuance and finesse in government procurement approaches, because the actual cost data has not been interrogated. How can you possibly, how can you charge me 30 quid an hour for a guy when the next nearest competitor is 50? How can that possibly be? And of course, from Carillion's point of view, it's all driven by turnover, isn't it? That's what the chief exec gets his bonus on. So it's a kind of self-reinforcing kind of thing, which I'm sure is covered in your book. Okay, thank you. I would like to bring the meeting to a close now. I'm aware that a number of people have had to leave. Thank you all for staying. Clearly, the time allotted was not necessarily enough for what we wanted to achieve. I'm just going to ask Charles just to say a couple of words, because I know he has something to say. And then I'll tell you about the next masterclass.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Well, today we've spent some really good time on planning and how to get success. But it seems to me, and this is on a slightly lighter note, but it seems to me that it's just like travel insurance. You wouldn't think of going skiing in Austria or on safari in Botswana without paying, your $100 travel insurance. That'll save you $10,000 when you break a leg or get charged down by a wild elephant. So it's much the same thing. Protect the project. Do the work. Do it properly. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so our next masterclass is on the 3rd of March, and our contributors will be Rudy Klein, who will be known to many of you, and Bob Wiley, who is the author of the book that we have mentioned. And in that masterclass, we'll have two perspectives on the problems that have been highlighted by the collapse of Carillion, and given that many of us are seeing the possibility of further failures, which have been just postponed, probably by the help that has been given during the pandemic. It has promised to be a very interesting and interactive session. So I hope you will join us then. In the meantime, I would like to thank Richard and Nick very much for the hard work that they put into bringing their vast portfolio of experience into the mix, and Charles too. So I bid you a very good rest of the day. Please email us with your comments. I would like to know whether you like this format or whether you like the breakout sessions. If you haven't attended the discussion groups before, perhaps you won't be able to make a comparison. But your thoughts about what we're doing here are really important to us. We'd like some idea of if we're hitting the spot, because we sure would like to hit the spot. I think that's all at the moment. So I bid you good afternoon and see you next time.
Thanks for your interest.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.